Hello everyone, my name is Amali Lokugamage and I'm a consultant obstetrician and gynecologist and honorary associate professor. I'd like to talk to you about translating cultural safety to the UK, but I'm recording this because of voice issues related to long COVID. And I'm giving this lecture with permission from my employers whilst on sick leave with long COVID. As you can see, it's a multi-system disorder from this wonderful illustration from someone who has long COVID. Having long COVID was quite bewildering, and this rather irreverent infographic kind of explains it. I'll let you know a little bit of the speech and language issues for me which are now resolving. I have a hoarse voice again today, but I've also had dysphonia, aphasia, a dysphasia, particularly with noun and naming things, and dysarthria last year. It's all part of a long COVID communication disorder, and it has enhanced my artistic potential, I have to say. I think my whole body slowed down, and it allowed things like poetry and visual intelligence to come to the front. Part of the verbal problems last year were word substitutions that took me by surprise. I've been known to say World Health Orangutan instead of WHO, or I've referred to my energy envelope in pacing for fatigue as an energy omelette, and referring to squid and chips for my son as squirrel and chips. And these substitutions are known and quite common with long COVID. And they're quite humorous, and they often sound like the word you're trying to get to, and they come out very unexpectedly. But hopefully I won't adorn this presentation with one of those. Also had a recurrent COVID throat rash, and I've been basically writing BMJ blogs to raise awareness of long COVID because of that bewilderment and wanting to seek health, and have written blogs about the vocal symptoms and been at the first WHO meeting on long COVID by patient activists. My mind got very poetic during acute COVID, and I penned a poetic book, and this was illustrated by a friend of mine who I went to medical school with, who also had acute COVID, and she painted and I wrote poetry just to sustain ourselves and support ourselves through acute COVID. And that sort of artistic or even visual thinking that amplified during long COVID has resulted and directly input into the creation of the infographic and the ideas in the cultural safety paper that I will discuss. Lessons I've learned: as with any doctor that's fallen sick, it causes a review. I felt my personhood was deconstructed, and actually I'm just rebooting now. And it was a rough ride, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to see whether I can regain and present amongst my peers. So, translating cultural safety to the UK, what does that mean? The paper that it took a year to write with co-authors from New Zealand and from Australia, and was initiated before I got sick, was published in July of this year. And there is this infographic, again, I think as a result of my long COVID vision, as it were. Where does it originate from? Cultural safety came about from an idea of a Maori nurse called Irihapiti Ramsden, and it has propagated to other previously colonized areas such as Australia and Canada, And what we looked at was the application of translating it to the UK to address structural racism. I regard cultural safety and its translation to the UK as a form of reverse innovation, which is a business term from innovating from low income settings or to high income settings. But in this context, it's from those who were colonized back to the previous colonizer as a sort of form of racial justice. And so the ex-British Empire could really humbly learn from others who have been subjugated and subordinated about the solutions that they have generated for dealing with structural racism and dealing with the blind spots in healthcare systems. And it's relevant because biomedicine was set up in colonial times and has the unconscious biases and power imbalances and privileges from a historical legacy. So structural racism is being recognised more and more. The Marmot Review highlighted this, and the Sewell Report tried to downplay it, but I think there was a scholarly backlash about that. There are certainly well-established discrepancies in morbidity and mortality between ethnic minorities, black and brown members of the population versus the white population, diabetes, mental health, palliative care, and of course COVID acute deaths, and amongst the staff of the NHS. And even this week, a report in my area about stillbirths and how there are blatant racial inequalities and socioeconomic determinants of health that could be addressed. So in order to look at cultural safety in the context of empire and colonialism and look at the decolonising framing of it, you first have to look back at Commonwealth migration to the UK and just recognise that that happened. Notable historical events were at the Idi Amin dictatorship. Ugandan Asians were forced to immigrate to the UK, and then you got the migration of the Windrush generation, and even now there are grave problems with trying to access NHS healthcare if you are a migrant. You've probably heard of cultural safety. Well, actually, sorry, you've probably heard of cultural competence and less so of cultural safety. And this table is in the paper, but I suppose a simple way of thinking about it is that cultural safety is perhaps more an advancement on the concepts of problems with racial equalities, because it deals with power imbalances, which cultural competence doesn't. It deals with the systemic issues, which again isn't addressed by cultural competence. It puts to the fore the concept of reflexivity, which is quite important. I'll speak on that later. And co-production is extremely important. And it's not ethnocentric, meaning it's not viewed through the Eurocentric construct of life, the universe, and everything, actually. Which brings me to the fact that our production of scientific knowledge has always been geographically biased. That is, it is weighted towards the global north, the colonizers, versus the global south, so that the very foundation on which we base healthcare is biased in one direction in terms of the way the West sees health. And as I've said before, Western medicine was set up in colonial times with all of these enduring, but maybe under the surface, colonial biases. At UCL, I've been engaged with my colleagues in decolonising the medical curriculum and teasing out the difference between the equality and diversity agenda and the decolonising agenda, and trying to understand that. And that's how I came to reach out to colleagues in New Zealand and Australia to write this paper on cultural safety. So, power is an important concept that is absent from medical education. And what we really need to lay bare is the location and concentration of it, and thereby understand the power imbalances and the oppressions exerted. And it's difficult to deal with the structure itself without engaging with a conversation about power. And this power exerts itself as structural iatrogenesis, where patients can be harmed by the unconscious or conscious racist power imbalances in the systems of healthcare, in the bureaucracy. And these systems that were set up were actually perhaps intended to help people in the first place. And so when reaching beyond the equality and diversity agenda, what is important in cultural safety is reflexivity. And in endeavouring to look at this, this is how cultural safety is superior. Reflectivity, which I think will be in the next slide, is something that the GMC look at in terms of reflective practice. But if you want to generate reflexivity, you've got to offer education that is transformational, have lots of public patient involvement, co-production of education, health services and development. And because of this mishmash of direction, the power imbalances get disturbed. It can be a bit of a fiery space, so you've got to keep calm, you've got to keep mindful, you've got to have courage when things become a bit heated. The solutions may not be apparent immediately, but just stick with it, and very innovative things can arise from it. So cultural safety. This infographic sort of has it all, and we have represented it as a tree because the New Zealand and the Australian authors and their Indigenous contributors thought it was respectful of the indigeneity of this concept. And you can see at the bottom, we've got the roots are from New Zealand, and these roots are being patient-centered or person-centered, staff self-reflexivity, and structural reflexivity. And so along the tree trunk, you get nurturing principles, healthcare human rights, and this commitment of institutions to review their biases, etc. And then the action or the intermingling of the ideas and the disruption of the power hierarchies can bear fruit, have flowers, have leaves, various initiatives. And I'm going to show you a table form of this diagram so that it might appear clearer to you. In fact, the reviewers of the paper only wanted this table, but we had to insist on the tree analogy as well. And so if you look under the kind of the upward direction from the roots, which is as I said, originate from Indigenous ideas. The nurturing principles are things that have already existed, plus some new concepts, such as really amplifying the patient experience, the framework, amplifying patient and user-led initiatives so that blind spots in the structure can be made visible through co-production, person-centeredness, especially, of course, engaging the voices of ethnic minorities and the availability of interpreters, as well as access to carers, if possible, from the similar cultural background. There are studies, certainly in neonatal care, that babies survive better with carers of a similar background. And continuity of care has a lot of evidence of relationships with people as opposed to fragmented care. And in terms of staff self-reflexivity, and reflexivity is this dynamic process of looking outwards and inwards at the moment and reacting to the present situation rather than looking back in the past. We should use more transformational learning. You can't change people's attitudes from showing them a PowerPoint presentation. You have to use the techniques of transformational learning. You have to present the historical legacy of healthcare to help people understand how the structure was created and the impact of power and privilege, and how it affects people in an intersectional sense. You could have mandatory cultural safety education. It could be part of reflective practice with the GMC. And also there is this reflection of ideas of healing, which are very Eurocentric and thereby respecting actually some of the homeostatic or ecological principles of Indigenous or traditional healing systems. And then in terms of the structure and the institution, allowing reverse innovation within the structure, laying bare the knowledge bias, improving training for diagnosis in dark skin, cyanosis, skin conditions, finding a way, well, we have this already in terms of inclusion, for addressing the attainment gap of people from ethnic minorities. And you can't achieve any of this in a compassionate way if you don't look at staff burnout and the compassion deficit that can result from it, and deal and help and prevent and improve working conditions for staff so that it doesn't happen. So the practicalities from that table are in education and in weaving the elements that pre-exist in the UK with some of the newer elements of the structural, the cultural safety tree. And we've talked about it as the nuts and bolts. And you do have to actually tailor the CS training to the syllabus or the organizational structure, but be mindful of cultural appropriation. I'll explain that later. So the nuts and bolts, as I've already attempted to explain, start from the roots, the tree trunks, into the branches and leaves, and resorting to the table, which is in the publication, would be helpful. But as a matter of grave importance is the diagnostics, improving the diagnostics for darker skins, so for cyanosis, oximetry, and for skin problems such as skin cancer, and to debate and really critically analyse whether our assumptions of renal function, GFR, are actually true, whether the data arise from data sets that are good quality and are not making assumptions. This is all work that is being unpicked as we speak. Also, the understanding that there can be transgenerational trauma, which is dealt with far more effectively with Indigenous ideas of healing, and in terms of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, there are publications on this. And this is relevant in areas such as cultural psychiatry. And we also have to be mindful, if you translate this into modern medicine, that this could be represented by weathering, the term of epigenetic change due to generational and lifetime hardships. And so that area is actually being unpicked at this present moment in time too. The knowledge bias has to be looked at in terms of research methodology, and there are academic endeavours reflecting on this now, but it's early days, it's embryonic, because science has led to the domination of sort of Western perspectives dominating other perspectives of health, and in this particular paradigm, the individual is isolated from nature, from the mind, from spirit, if you're talking about indigenous ideas. And because of this domination, this distorts the outcome of research, and also the funder objectives also distort the outcome of research. So there is actually much to be overturned. And because this week COP26 is happening in the UK, and we're talking about climate change, there is, in terms of healthcare and the wisdom of indigeneity and cultural safety, is a concept that arises from that background. There we have to, as healthcare workers, have our eye on our impact on the Anthropocene, which is this sort of Earth epoch, geological epoch, which is based on the fact that humans have damaged the biosphere. And there are these emerging fields of planetary health, which are here. I won't talk about it great depth, but you could look to Lancet Planetary Health for numerous publications. That we must actually learn from ecological health care systems, have the humility to learn from that, not just in terms of clinical health, but public health. And areas which we could look at are the microbiome or even immunonutrition. And there is much to learn with that sort of humility and that active listening. But with all things that we can learn from those who are colonized, we should make sure we don't culturally appropriate it. And that's why we had the cultural safety tree idea, as the people that contributed said that was respectful. And cultural appropriation is when members of one culture adopt or misappropriate elements of another culture, often the historically disadvantaged. In the context of health, it could be when you try to dovetail cultural safety into pre-existing systems, but that's where you have to just make sure that you underpin cultural safety by actually stating where its origins as a sign of respect. We have appropriated in medicine many indigenous medicines, and we do not realize that. And that is cultural. That's an example of pharmaceutical cultural appropriation. It can also occur in other areas such as mindfulness, acupuncture, yoga, but it's something that one has to be always aware of when dealing with the intersection of science, biomedicine, and indigenous space. And so there is this tension, but we must really bridge the gap in a respectful way, and understanding that there is much to learn with the disruption of the power imbalances by listening to people and the structures meeting and innovating from the patient voice and their perspectives. And that is what decolonising does. It's dismantling whole systems. And that dismantling of unfair power hierarchies can be discombobulating. And that's why the public engagement space for this can be discombobulating. Because, as I said, in co-opting and bending the decolonising discourse to adhere to Eurocentric constraints, this is a quote by Idioma Nod in Opera, we could view the situations in binary terms and not really see how multifaceted and intersectional and how possibly harmonious it could be. And we shouldn't constrain it with framing approaches such as pragmatic versus philosophical, but really it's each knowledge base informing and depending on each other. It's more in the philosophical kind of debate, more a kind of a root system of interchange rather than a rigid hierarchical system. And that's what we should really aspire towards in terms of cultural safety. So I end my talk here with you now, and thank you for listening, and also thank the young student doctors who were medical students and my other colleagues here and in New Zealand and Australia for contributing to the work that bore fruition in the cultural safety tree. Thank you very much.